All right. Well, thanks so much to everyone for joining us today. My name is David Ullian, and I'm joined here by my colleague Meg Nash. We're attorneys at Vicente LLP. And today's webinar, we're going to be discussing the medical cannabis program expansion, implementation of it, as well as new business opportunities for operators. Next slide, please. Before I forget, if we are going to hopefully leave some time for questions at the end. So feel free to jot any questions you have in the Q&A portion at the bottom of the screen. And like I said, we will try to answer as many of those as we can. So just a little bit about our firm. Vicente LLP is a national cannabis and psychedelics law firm. For over a decade, we've helped clients navigate laws, regulations, and build and grow businesses and shape public policy to advance legal cannabis, hemp, and psychedelics across the country and across the globe. We work with clients all across the country, but have physical offices in a few different states, including California, Colorado, Florida, Massachusetts, Michigan, Minnesota, New York, New Jersey, and Texas. And we provide a lot of different services, including federal, state, and local licensing, corporate and transactional representation, regulatory compliance, including other types of services sort of outside the realm of legal services itself, including economic analysis, market research, policy, drafting and advocacy, and government relations as well. So today, like I said, we'll be joined by myself and my colleague Meg Nash. Again, I'm David Ullian. I'm a partner at Vicente. I focus my practice primarily on licensing, local permitting, and regulatory compliance. I've worked with a wide range of clients, varying from multi-state operators to small family-owned startup companies, and help them navigate the ever-changing regulatory landscape in the cannabis industry, and including obtaining state and local licenses, permits, and approvals. Before this, I joined the firm in April 2016, so I've been here about 7 years. And before this, I was a staff attorney at a local law firm in Boston, specializing in criminal defense and government investigations. And I'm licensed to practice in Washington, D.C., as well as states of Massachusetts, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And I will kick it over to Meg to tell you a little bit about herself.
Thank you, David. My name is Meg Nash. I'm also a partner at Vicente LLP. I'm based out of our Boston office, but I've also been very fortunate to work with clients across the country, particularly in merit licensing applications, where there are kind of a limited number of licenses available, where it's a highly competitive process. I've been fortunate to work with applicants in DC, as well as New Jersey, Illinois, Connecticut, and I'm very much looking forward to working with applicants in Washington, DC, as well as Maryland, as that market is just opening up as well. I'm also barred in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, and I describe myself as a recovering litigator. I've worked at a number of law firms in Boston prior to joining Vicente in 2019, and have been really just thoroughly enjoying my practice and the opportunity to work with aspiring entrepreneurs as they enter into this exciting market.
All right, thanks, Meg. So we're just going to jump into it. So first off, I just want to give a sort of a general overview of cannabis legalization in Washington, D.C. It's a sort of a unique jurisdiction and has a kind of a unique history as well. So next slide, please. So medical cannabis in Washington, D.C. goes back quite a ways. In 1998, the voters of D.C. approved a medical cannabis voter initiative. But unfortunately, due to the setup of the governance of DC, that was blocked by the federal Congress via the budget legislation for about the next 11 years. So despite the desires of the local residents of DC wanting a medical cannabis program, that was not something they were able to do for many years. And then in 2010, the DC Council passed a statute legalizing and setting up a regulated medical cannabis program. This time it was allowed to go forward by the US Congress. Initially, it was regulated by the DC Department of Health, and the first medical dispensary sales began in 2013. So sort of a long time coming for medical cannabis in DC, but only about past 10 years have there actually been sales to patients. So in 2014, the voters again voted to approve what's called Initiative 71 or I-71, as a lot of people refer to it. And this approved the legalization, possession, cultivation, and free transfer of limited amounts of cannabis for personal use by adults 21 and over. So again, it's important to understand that this is unrelated to medical cannabis, and it basically legalizes the small cultivation, use, and possession for personal use, or some people refer to it as recreational use. But it did not set up a regulated adult use market like we've seen in other states. So important to keep that in mind. And then in 2015, there was a federal legislation bill that included what was called the Harris Rider. And that it blocked and continues to block the district from establishing a regulated adult use cannabis market like we've seen in many other states. So despite the desire of the voters to have both a medical market and an adult use market, there is currently no legal adult use regulated cannabis market where an individual 21 plus could just walk into an adult use dispensary and purchase product like they're able to do in many other states. Next slide. So over the next few years, from 2016 to 2018, there was a slow and steady expansion of the medical cannabis program. So a variety of things happened, including increasing the purchase amounts that a patient can buy at one time. There was an expansion that allowed patients to shop at any legal dispensary that was in DC rather than just one. And a major expansion was recognizing reciprocity for out-of-state patients. So this market was opened up to people who lived in other states and were medical patients in other states who could then come to DC and use their medical card from that other state to buy medical cannabis products in DC. This is something we've seen in other jurisdictions, but not every jurisdiction. But this is something that definitely expanded the program in DC. And then in 2022, a statute was passed on an emergency basis that allowed individuals 21 and older to self-certify during the patient registration process that they had a qualifying medical condition that could be treated with medical cannabis. And I can't stress enough how kind of major this was. I have not heard about it in any other jurisdiction that a patient could sort of self-certify that they needed medical cannabis as part of their process. In every other jurisdiction I'm aware of, it requires going to a licensed medical physician or other healthcare provider and having them certify that the patient is in need of medical cannabis. So again, this was just on an emergency basis, but a major development that would significantly expand the number of patients who could access medical cannabis. And then the biggest thing and the main part of our presentation today is the Medical Cannabis Amendment Act, which was passed in 2022 and went into effect in March 2023. And that resulted in a major overhaul of the medical cannabis program on a number of different fronts. And we're going to get into that a little bit more in this presentation. Then after that, I just wanted to mention there's a related sort of a statute that was passed earlier this year and went into effect in July of 2023 that provided a lot of protections for employees of private companies who could no longer have enforcement or adverse action taken against them for use of cannabis off premises during non-working hours. So again, another way in which the potential that provides protection for cannabis users and as well as for medical cannabis users who could no longer be terminated from their place of employment simply for using cannabis off work, off hours. Next slide. So this provides a little snapshot of the current market, medical cannabis market in DC. As you can see, there's only a limited number of dispensaries, legal dispensaries. There's 6, and this shows you the different wards that are located in the district. There's also a very limited number of medical cannabis cultivation centers, also 6, and those are only located in certain wards as well. Patient numbers as of June of this year were a little over 21,690 patients, and monthly dispensary sales exceeded 3 million. So up until now, it's been a somewhat limited program, but as we discussed, we think some of the newest changes are going to significantly expand this market, medical cannabis market in DC. Next slide. So just to try to give you an overview of the Medical Cannabis Amendment Act, some of the key provisions. So you may have heard before of the regulatory body. It was called ABRA. That has now been updated to the Alcoholic Beverage and Cannabis Administration, ABCA, and then the board that actually makes decisions impacting the medical cannabis market is now called the Alcoholic Beverage and Cannabis Board. So sort of a minor update, but it's important to just recognize that this is not a separate new agency that has been created. It's just renaming the regulatory authority that had already been regulating cannabis to clarify that they also now are regulating cannabis. Again, as I mentioned before, the Medical Cannabis Act permanently set that patients 21 and older could self-certify that they need medical cannabis to treat one of their medical conditions as part of the registration process. So now, not just on an emergency basis, but a permanent part of the law going forward. And just, again, very, very rare and interesting part of this type of program. Another major part was that, as I mentioned, there was only about 6 dispensaries and cultivation centers that had been licensed. So the new statute eliminates the total number of medical cannabis businesses that can be operational in DC. So it's no longer limited to 6. There may be other reasons why in practice there won't be just an increasing unlimited number of licenses, but that has gone away. And in addition, as part of the new process, they have eliminated competitive license application sorting. So if you submit an application and it complies with all the different requirements, then you should be able to get a license. It's no longer, a very highly competitive process like we see in some other jurisdictions, and as it was a few years back in DC. In addition, another major part of the program was that they increased the types of licenses that were allowed. So up until this point, it had really just been medical cannabis dispensaries and cultivation centers. Now they've increased that to 3 additional license types to include couriers, and I'll get more into that later, as well as manufacturers, and as well as internet retailers. So a lot more different types of licenses available for people who just want to focus on a particular part of the cannabis industry in DC. In addition to that, a new part will be availability of endorsements, which are certain permissions that are granted to retailers to engage in different types of operations as part of their retail license. Again, we'll get into that in a little bit. As we've seen in a lot of jurisdictions, there's now a priority for the promotion of social equity in the cannabis market. And going forward, at least 50% of all new licenses issued by in DC are going to be reserved for social equity applicants. And that will there are also a number of different benefits for social equity applicants. So if you're able to qualify as one of those types of applicants, there are a lot of advantages to that. Other additional parts include a new medical cannabis sales tax holiday in April, where the 6% sales tax will be completely eliminated for a few days in April. Another very interesting part is that there's a recognition that there currently is a number of unlicensed operators who are distributing cannabis in DC. Some of them are referred to as I-71 shops, but these are basically, I'm sure if you've been in DC, you've probably seen them, but they look like licensed cannabis dispensaries. They operate like that, but they are not formally licensed by the DC board or administration. And so recognizing that, they have set forth an actual pathway for these unlicensed operators to obtain a medical cannabis business license and become fully regulated and licensed. For those sort of related to that, there are now also going to be increased civil enforcement authority and penalties for these unlicensed cannabis businesses that I just mentioned, as well as potential penalties for property owners that allow unlicensed operators to occur on the premises. So not only is there a pathway forward for those who want to become legal and join the regulated market, but there is now even more incentive to do that, considering there will be increased enforcement action against those who choose to continue forward operating the way they have been without a license. Next slide. So again, just a little bit more about the patient self-certification. So before this most recent amendment or change in the law, like in many jurisdictions, a patient had to make an appointment with a licensed healthcare provider and speak with them and have the healthcare provider determine that they qualified to receive medical cannabis or had a certain medical condition that could be treated with medical cannabis. So the change in the law now just removes that requirement, and you can still actually go to a healthcare provider and get that recommendation if you'd like, but that is no longer absolutely required as part of the registration process. So if you go on the online website, you'll see that there is a way for you to just register yourself and certify for yourself that you need medical cannabis for your condition. And again, this is a major expansion of the market. You can imagine there may be a lot of people who just for whatever reason would prefer not to take the time or spend the money to be diagnosed or meet with a healthcare provider for their certification. So I think this will be another way that there will be a major expansion of the number of patients who are eligible to participate in the medical cannabis program in DC. Slide. As I mentioned, there's a new tax holiday. So during this period of time from April 15th to April 24th, there'll be no sales tax. And we expect that to be quite a busy time for patients who want to take advantage of more accessible, less expensive product during this time period. Next slide. Again, mentioned that there are a lot of operators who are currently unlicensed and are engaged in especially the retail sale of cannabis. And so there'll be increased enforcement action possible against those, including potential jail time and or a fine. And any fines that are, any funds received from any of these monetary fines will be deposited into the Medical Cannabis Administration Fund, and that'll be used to fund the medical cannabis program, as well as grant needed loans and funding for social equity applicants who are looking for assistance with their business. Slide. All right, and as I mentioned before, this new law prohibits employers from taking adverse actions against certain employees who use cannabis during non-work hours and off premises. It's not, I just want to make sure people understand, it's not every type of job, but certainly most types of private employers will no longer be able to fire or fail to hire or take other types of adverse actions against employees. But there are certain types of jobs, particularly ones that have a sensitive or security nature to them, or a particular nature of the position, such that this would not apply for them. They could still, employers could still take adverse action against those types of employees. So important to be aware of what type of job is actually qualifies under this new law. But again, this is another way in which the potential number of patients who can participate in this market could increase if there's no longer going to be a potential adverse action related to that person's employment. Next slide. All right, and I
Thanks,
think I'll hand
David.
I'll hand it back over to Meg to dive into more of the actual license parts of the new program. Go ahead, Meg.
Wonderful, thank you. I appreciate the overview of kind of all these developments in the law. I certainly always think it's helpful to kind of understand where we've been as we kind of chart forward where we're going. So first, we're going to take a look at the different license types that are going to be currently available in DC. As David mentioned, this is going to be a bit of a switch from the existing program in place. First, cultivation centers. This is a facility, a license that allows you to grow and cultivate cannabis and then sell it wholesale to retailers. There are currently licensed cultivators in DC, and we expect that this number will expand in the upcoming licensing rounds. The manufacturing license type is a new type of license, which essentially allows for the processing, packaging, and labeling of medical cannabis products, such as edibles, other, kind of forms of cannabis other than flower for consumption, to make them available to patients and caregivers in DC. Additionally, there will be a retail license. This will be kind of the traditional storefront dispensary where patients, kind of self-certified patients or caregivers, will be able to go and purchase cannabis, medical cannabis, and cannabis products in that retail dispensary. Dispensaries are also allowed to manufacture or purchase and sell paraphernalia in their shops. So it's kind of an additional business model tacking on to the cannabis products or cannabis flower that may be available in those locations. We also see some new license types under the Medical Cannabis Amendment Act. That includes an internet retailer. This is somewhat similar to the retail dispensary license, although it doesn't include a physical storefront. It does allow for direct to consumer, direct to patient or caregiver delivery, where you can have an online presence and then kind of deliver those products to patients and caregivers. In addition, there is a courier license type. This is essentially the delivery arm for, it can be an internet retailer or a retailer. And I think that kind of one of the policy ambitions with both of these license types is to create kind of better access to being able to participate in the market, as each of these license type may have kind of lower barriers to entry as it relates to capital, where you may not need kind of an official storefront for an internet retailer, and you can kind of have more bespoke operations as a courier while participating in the legal medical cannabis industry in DC. Finally, there will be testing laboratory licenses available. These are a crucial part of the cannabis, the regulated medical cannabis market, to ensure, again, kind of satisfaction of those policy goals, to make sure that there are safe, regulated products available for patients and caregivers. I don't believe there may be one testing lab, and maybe tops two in DC at this point, but the testing lab license is a critical component, again, to ensuring that wholesalers, manufacturers, retailers are selling safe products. In addition, the Medical Cannabis Act has included these specific retailer-only endorsements to kind of expand the scope of operations. Endorsements are additional operating permissions for retailers that allow them to offer more services. They are exclusively available to retailers as opposed to other license types. And retail applicants can request any combination of endorsements in their initial application or at any time after license issuance by submitting a retailer license endorsement application. But that endorsement will only be valid for the duration of the associated license. It will be another thing that you would need to renew and keep track of in your license and compliance maintenance. These endorsements include a delivery endorsement. This would permit retailers to provide medical cannabis or medical cannabis products to be delivered to eligible patients and their caregivers at residential and commercial building addresses located in DC proper. It also facilitates curbside pickup or delivery with the note that those can only take place between 9 a.m. and 9 p.m. Wherever that is available 7 days a week. If the licensee has an internet retailer license, there's no requirement to obtain a delivery endorsement to deliver medical cannabis. So once again, that kind of internet retailer specific license contemplates kind of the e-commerce sale and then direct to patient and caregiver delivery. Another kind of unique component here in DC is the safety use treatment, which is essentially kind of functions as an on-site consumption license, where it allows on-premise consumption of medical cannabis and medical cannabis products that are purchased on-site at the retailer within specific consumption areas. These areas must be separated from the remainder of the premises by a secure door, as well as sufficient ventilation, likely, pretty robust HVAC system that will incorporate carbon filtration to ensure kind of any issues would not create kind of issues or nuisance within the neighborhood. A safe use treatment facility can sell food that does not contain cannabis in the facility, and they can also offer recorded or background music. So it's really a matter which retailer is able to provide a safe space to consume.
Hey Meg. Hey Meg.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. We're just having a little trouble hearing you. Sounding a little bit muffled.
Okay. Is it any better now?
Not to me.
Okay. Maybe I'll try to call in and you can pick up the slide.
Sure. While Meg is dealing with some technical issues, I'll pick it up here. So like she was saying, the safe use treatment, it's a sort of an on-site consumption model. We've seen similar types of licenses in other states, usually on the adult use side, where we have social consumption establishments. But this will be an area that's designated for people to consume in a safe way on the premises. And this can be very helpful for people who live in certain types of housing and aren't allowed to consume in public and aren't allowed to consume in their housing for whatever reason. So again, this is a very unique type of thing to see in a medical cannabis market, but is another type that will be available just for retailers going forward. Next slide, Maggie. All right, so another type of endorsement is what's called a summer garden. It's kind of an interesting name, but it permits the sale and on-premises consumption of medical cannabis products within a private outdoor space. So again, it's sort of similar to the safe use treatment endorsement, but it'll be in an outdoor space. And this will be available for both a retailer and someone who has an indoor safe use treatment facility. But there are some limitations on when and when these types of summer gardens will be able to operate. And the final endorsement type is a holder of a retail license to offer cooking and how-to classes, demonstrations, and tastings for educational purposes. It's called an education tasting. Again, these are going to be limited in what types of hours they may be able to operate. But again, very, very unique to have these as part of a medical cannabis program. It's I think you can get the sense that the District of Columbia was really trying to expand their program to be as similar to the adult use market we see in other parts of the country. But again, since they're limited to just medical, they're still expanding it in every way that they can. But for people who are able to get one of these retailer licenses, I do think that these could be very interesting to have and very unique in how they're operated. But again, these are only for the brick and mortar facility retailers. No other license types can have these. Next slide. All right, so we'll get a little bit more into licensing opportunities. Next slide. So for people interested in applying for these licenses, you can only apply during certain open periods where the district will be accepting license applications. So some of these open periods have already opened and closed, and others are going to be coming up soon in the rest of 2023 and into 2024. So for operators that are currently licensed and are currently have been operating in DC, they'll be eligible to apply for cultivation center, manufacturer, and retailer licenses from May of this year through May of 2024. Again, this will be a very limited number of people since there are only a limited number of licensed operators in DC. Probably the most important one coming up will be for social equity and non-social equity applicants who will be able to apply for courier, cultivation center, and manufacturer licenses starting at the end of this month through October 30th of 2023. And for people who may be a little confused by this, initially the plan had been for only the standard applicants, which are the non-social equity applicants, to apply for these types of licenses in the upcoming months. But the district, the ABCO expanded this to also allow social equity applicants to continue to apply for these licenses. But for those interested in these three license types, you should be aware that the application open period is coming up very soon, within the week, and applications are accepted on a first come basis. So again, if this is what you want to do and you fall into this category of the types of applicants that are eligible to apply, definitely want to get on that as soon as you can. The next open period will be for unlicensed operators. Again, these were the ones I mentioned earlier that have been these I-71 gifting stores that have just been operating without a license for the past few years. They'll be eligible to apply for cultivation center, retailer, and internet retailer licenses from November 1st of this year through the end of January of 2024. Next slide. So a little bit more on the unlicensed operators. So these are like I said, the I-71s that have been selling a variety of goods as well as gifting cannabis. Because under the current I-71 law, you can transfer for free a limited amount of cannabis, and what they do is they say, you can buy this T-shirt or this pencil or this keychain or something like that, and it comes with a gift of cannabis. So I think the idea is the district really wants to move away from that and try to have these unregulated operators start to become regulated and have their product tested and taxed. And so they've established this open period for them to apply for licenses. And you have to meet certain criteria to be able to apply for it. So you have to have a valid business license before December 31st of last year, and in continuous operations since then. A valid certificate of occupancy prior to the date of when you submit your application. And you have to prove that you've been paying your taxes every year. So not just anybody can apply for this. You have to be a certain type of business that's basically been operating in compliance with all laws, except they just have not had a license from the cannabis authorities. And there are some restrictions on where these can be located. So if you have one of these stores and you find that maybe you're too close to another licensed retailer, you may have the opportunity to relocate to another location when you submit your application. Next slide. And so for those who are interested in the retailer and internet retailer licenses, for social equity applicants, that open period will be from March 1st of next year through April 30th of next year. That will be for the retailer and internet retailer licenses. And then last will be the non-social equity applicants who can apply for retailer and internet retailer licenses starting in July 1st of next year through the end of August of next year. So again, these are very limited windows to apply. So it's important to be aware of when these periods are and what types of license you're applying for, what type of category of applicant you fall into, so that you can be ready to submit a complete application as soon as the open period begins. Next slide. So social equity, as I mentioned before, the new law requires that at least 50% of all new licenses are reserved for social equity applicants. And in the most recent social equity applicant period, that was from May through June of this year, there were 46 applications accepted, and that has a breakdown of 24 cultivation, 20 manufacturer, and 2 courier. And it's important that the ownership of these businesses be structured correctly. So if the regulators find out that you're maybe trying to get around some of the requirements by having straw ownership, or you're not adequately or accurately disclosing your ownership correctly to meet the eligibility for social equity, there could be penalties for that. So again, there really is an emphasis on trying to reserve these licenses for legitimate, genuine social equity businesses. So again, important to make sure your business is structured appropriately when it's formed. Next slide. And then feel free to jump back in here whenever you'd like. All right. So the social equity criteria, again, if you want to apply for these types of licenses, it's important that you make sure you meet the criteria. And I would definitely pay close attention to what the criteria is in DC, because what may qualify as social equity in another jurisdiction won't necessarily qualify you in DC. So the top three sections you see here are the three eligibility criteria, and you have to meet at least two of them. So the first one is at least one owner who is a DC resident who owns at least 50% of the business and is a returning citizen. And returning citizen means a person who was arrested, convicted, or incarcerated for a cannabis or drug-related offense. The second criteria is an owner who's a DC resident, owns at least 50% of the business, and is married to, or in a civil union with, or has a child with, or is the child of a person, or a non-parent legal guardian, or a grandparent or sibling of someone who has been arrested, convicted, or incarcerated for a cannabis or drug-related offense. And I highlighted, I put in bold this language in the second bullet about a grandparent or sibling who was arrested, convicted, or incarcerated, because that is a very recent change that the district made by statute to increase the eligibility for social equity. So I definitely would be careful about looking at some prior materials that maybe are missing some of this language, because this could potentially qualify you, in a way that maybe you weren't able to qualify under the prior language of the statute. And then the third criteria is an owner who's a DC resident, owns at least 50% of the business, and has a certain income that does not exceed 150% of the median family income. So again, you only have to meet at least two of these criteria. You could meet all three, but definitely important to make sure that you actually qualify before you try to submit one of these applications. Next slide. So property considerations, obviously, finding a property can be very difficult, especially in a small area like DC that's very crowded and may not have a lot of open properties for different types of businesses. So important to make sure that your property is zoned correctly and complies with any kind of buffer restriction. So for retailers, you cannot be within 400 feet of another retailer. For other types of cannabis businesses other than courier, you can't be within 300 feet of a school or rec center. And though that rule has an exception, it can depend on where the main entrance of the school is. If it's actually in a zoning area that's zoned commercial or industrial. So again, important to make sure that if you find a property that it's actually going to work from a zoning perspective, or else you won't be able to operate there. And then there's a local element too for advisory neighborhood commissions. They're called ANCs. These are local neighborhood bodies that are going to have an opportunity to submit comments on any application for a business that's located in their ward. And so, this is another thing that is important to keep in mind, because if you face a lot of opposition from the local neighborhood, it could be potentially problematic for you to receive a license. So always good to make sure that you're coordinating with your neighbors and the butters and addressing any concerns that they might have. Next slide. All right, so as I mentioned, there's no total cap on the number of licenses that can be issued, but as I mentioned before, at least 50% of all new licenses have to be reserved for social equity. So in the prior round, there were a number of license applications accepted for social equity applicants. So the numbers that will be available for non-social equity applicants in this upcoming round that begins at the end of August, it will be 24 cultivation centers, 20 manufacturers, and 2 couriers. And again, these will be considered, applications will be considered on a first come basis. So it would be advantageous to make sure you have a complete application ready to submit as soon as the open application period starts. There also are some important license limitations to keep in mind. So if you're a cultivator licensee, you can't have more than 2 cultivator licenses and or more than 1 retailer license. So, you know, it's not there is some restrictions to keep in mind. So if you have a retailer license, you can't hold more than a combined total of 3 retailer and internet retailer licenses. Internet retailers cannot have any interest in a cultivation center license. A courier license cannot have any other type of license at all. And then a testing lab cannot have an interest in another type of license. So again, important to keep in mind for exactly what type of operations you want to do. So for example, if you are thinking that you might want to do a courier and a retailer or courier and a manufacturer, you want to think about that before you start applying, since you might not be able to hold all those types of licenses. Next slide. So this provides an overview of what the advisory neighborhood commissions, as I mentioned, they're going to have an opportunity to comment on any application for a business that's located in their ward. So they will be able to submit comments or concerns regarding a potential business. And this shows you some of the things that the statute allows them to comment on. So, you know, effects on property values, peace and quiet, parking, sort of standard types of concerns that are always arise for any type of cannabis business in DC or in other places. So again, more important than ever to make sure you have a property that seems like it makes sense and it would be a good fit for the local community. Next slide. All right, so just a little bit about the actual applications themselves for the courier, cultivation, and manufacturing applications that are coming up. So you have to be 21 to apply, current on all your taxes, and able to get a certificate of clean hands from the Office of Tax and Revenue, and can't have a prior felony conviction for a crime of violence, gun offense, tax evasion, fraud, or credit card fraud within the 3 years before you apply for the license. So again, you want to make sure when you're structuring your business that people who are on the license are actually going to be able to be eligible to hold the license. Can't be a certifying physician. And this shows the application fees will be $8,000 for the cultivation center, $2,000 for social equity, because I mentioned there are 75% reduction for social equity applicants, $4,000 for courier and $4,000 for manufacturer. Social equity applicants obviously have to prove that they're social equity. So there'll be a certain documentation that those types of applicants will submit to prove that they qualify as a social equity applicant as part of their application. And then certain types of businesses can qualify as CBEs, and this is not a requirement to apply, but it can be another advantageous status for any type of applicant who's able to obtain this certification. Next slide. So this provides a layout of some of the main parts of the application, and you do need to submit a complete application in order for it to be accepted. So you can see here, certainly if you have a property, then you want to have a valid zoning determination letter, a proof of your property interests, complete application form, and then a variety of plans such as a security plan, site plan, floor plan, and full disclosure of your ownership for anyone who owns at least 1% of the business. Other documentation is sort of standard corporate documentation. If you have a trade name or a DBA, you're doing business as name, you can provide that. A certificate of good standing to show that your company is in good standing with corporations, as well as a GIS map to show that you are not, within any kind of buffer restriction for schools and recreation centers. So overall, compared to other license application processes in other states, this is not too burdensome, but again, very important to make sure you provide a complete application in order to have it reviewed and accepted efficiently and quickly. Next slide. So you do have a way to provide a what's called a conditional license application. So if you want to apply for a certain license type, but you don't have a property available already, you can still submit the rest of the application documents and you will get what's called a conditional license. And from then you have 1 year after you're given approval of your conditional license to provide the rest of the documentation. So proof of your property interest, security plan, certificate of occupancy, the permit, sort of the rest of the application documents. And then there are some restrictions on when those applications, if they can be transferred or sold to a new owner within that year, as well as when the 45-day public comment period for the ANC start. But I think this is a good way for people to kind of get in the queue and submit an application, even if they have not yet totally finalized exactly where their facility is going to be located. Next slide. All right, and so just a little bit more about the social equity applicant advantages and benefits. Next slide. So again, very advantageous to be a social equity applicant since at least half of all the new licenses are reserved for them. There are, as I said before, certain open application periods that are only available for social equity applicants. And as we've seen, sometimes these open periods can change. We've just seen that where social equity applicants will be able to apply during this upcoming August through October time period that initially had only been reserved for non-social equity applicants. So it's important to kind of keep up to date on any changes that are happening. But you'll also have reduced fees on applications and licensing fees for the first 3 years, as well as potential eligibility to receive grants and loans from the social equity fund. So if you're having a tough time finding financing, which is certainly very common in the cannabis industry, a social equity applicant or a CVE may be able to apply for and if you receive some financial help from a social equity fund that was set up to help these types of applicants. Next slide. Right, just a couple tips and recommendations for success. So again, these are 5 things that are that we always see are very important in any kind of license application, whether it's in DC or otherwhere. Properties, very important. That can sometimes be the hardest part of this entire process is actually finding a property that works and is available and is reasonably affordable. But unless you're a courier, every facility needs a property. So that would be something I would definitely recommend looking at and getting started on as soon as possible. Community support, as I mentioned, the ANCs have a public comment period where they can voice concerns about your business. So always good to kind of walk the neighborhood and be in touch with neighboring businesses, just try to see if you can address any concerns they have so that they won't oppose your application during that open comment period. Having a good team in place is also very important. It's always good to have experienced people with operational expertise and for running the business, both just running a business generally, as well as having cannabis expertise. So if you're trying to do a cultivation facility, you obviously would want someone who was experienced in indoor cannabis cultivation. But yeah, so we definitely have seen where it can be difficult to have a successful business without the right people in place. Access to capital has always been an issue. There isn't the typical access to banking and other lending that we see in other types of industries, and it can be very difficult for cannabis businesses to obtain the kind of financing they need to get their business off the ground. So, I always tell people to try to have, 2 to 3 times more money than you think, just because it's difficult to navigate this process, and issues will come up that will cost money to get through. So I would absolutely recommend that you really think hard about if you have a sufficient amount of money to get you through the application process, through the build out, through the inspections. And it's not just the application process. You will need support from architects and engineers and security and accounting, and there's a variety of sort of ancillary service providers that you'll need along the way. And all that costs money. And then there's very strict regulations. It's a highly regulated industry. There are very specific requirements for the application process and certainly your operations once you're up and running. So important to keep that in mind. Regulatory compliance is a very, very important thing. And there are people who can help you kind of navigate that, but it's important that you try to comply with all the rules so that there's no reason why any sort of regulatory body could cause you to cease operations. Next slide. And that sort of sums it up. I know that was kind of a lot, and we have about 10 minutes, but we can try to open it up to some questions and see how many we can get through. Before we do, I'll just see if Meg is, if you're still with us.
Yes, can you hear me better now?
Still a bit of an echo, but we will try to at least start with some questions. All right, let me try to look at some of these. Okay, so here's a question. Does registering for a medical cannabis card increase personal health insurance rates in DC or elsewhere? So I can't say I know the definitive answer to that. There certainly may be some considerations for your health insurance rates depending on the medical conditions that you have. That's just not my area of expertise. So I can't say one way or the other, but I think that simply by registering for a medical cannabis card, I don't think that alone would cause an increase in personal health insurance rates, but certainly if it's tied to a specific kind of illness that's diagnosed by a medical provider that you would need to disclose to your health insurance provider, that could certainly increase your rates. All right. So here's a question. In your opinion, what percentage of I-71 retailers will be able to show up-to-date tax payment, therefore will be eligible for a license? So my assumption is that most I-71 retailers have otherwise legitimate businesses. They pay taxes, they have certificates of occupancy, and they're otherwise in all ways legitimate businesses, except for not having a license. I can't say that is a guarantee, especially for some of the delivery businesses that really operate just online. But I'd say for most, brick and mortar I-71 retailers, I'd say most of them should be able to provide up-to-date tax documentation. And certainly they would need to do that in order to be eligible for a license. And if they aren't, I would recommend that they do that if the ultimate objective is to complete that kind of pathway to a license. Here's a question. Why aren't retailer licenses available for social equity and non-social equity applicants? So they are. Retailer licenses will be available for both social equity and non-social equity applicants. It's just that will be towards the end of the open application period. So there will be, in 2024 will be the open application period. There'll be one for social equity and then a second one at the end, starting in July of 2024 for non-social equity applicants. And that would be for both retailer and internet retailer licenses. Question, are all applications except all or lottery based? So there's no lottery as part of this process. Applications are accepted on a first come basis. So you would want to try to sort of get in the queue as soon as the open period begins. And then depending on when you submitted it, assuming you have a complete application, is who would be considered by the board. So no lottery, but it does seem like the timing of when your application is submitted will be important to if you're actually going to be considered for a license. Are I-71 the only entities eligible to apply for internet license? No. Internet retailer licenses will eventually be available for any type of applicant. There is a specific open period for unlicensed operators to apply for these, but then subsequently there will be other entities, social equity and non-social equity applicants who will be able to apply for internet retailer licenses. Social equity criteria. So I went through that in the presentation. Hopefully you were able to see what the criteria are, but again, it's very specific criteria and it does differ in some ways from other states. So again, important to look very closely at the criteria and structure your business in a way that you actually meet that if that is the goal. Question, is there a rubric page limit to the written content? I'm not aware of that. I've looked at the application and there will be some there will be a ability to include supplemental pages to your application. So for some of the narratives about your security plans or your knowledge of cannabis law, there will be an opportunity to add additional information that you can include as an attachment. That's either uploaded to your online application or included with your PDF or as part of your hard copy submission. But I am not aware of any kind of page limit that will limit the amount that you're able to include for any of your narrative plans. Question: does the qualifying arrest for a social equity applicant owner need to have occurred in DC? So the answer to that is no. The person does need to currently be a DC resident, but the arrest or conviction or incarceration could have occurred in another place, as long as you're kind of able to prove that. It's not limited to people who are arrested for cannabis or other drug-related crimes in DC. All right. Question: how does medical cannabis certification training provider apply, and who does it apply to? Managers only. That I'm not quite sure about, but if you'd like to get in touch with me afterwards, I could look into it further. All right. Do you expect the queue to be filled with conditional applications, or do you foresee there being enough fully completed applications already? So I do think there'll be a decent number of conditional applications for people who just want to get an application in, but don't currently have a property. But I would recommend that you try to get a property and submit that as part of your application if possible. But my understanding is that conditional license applications will be treated the same as other ones. It's just that after they're accepted, you will have that 1-year period to find a property and submit the remaining documentation to have a full license issued. All right, so we're almost out of time. I'll just open it up to Meg again, if you're still with us, for any kind of last words.
Just thank you to you, David.
All right, no problem. And hopefully people can still see. I've listed our contact information on this last slide for myself and for Meg. These are our direct phone lines as well as our email addresses. So if you're interested in learning more or you need any assistance with this application or any future applications, certainly reach out and we'd be happy to try to assist.